Okay, welcome everybody to the Hague Program Book Seminar. My name is Julia Carver. I'm a postdoctoral researcher with the Hague Program. And today we're very pleased and excited to have Professor Milton Mueller, who will be presenting his recent book, Declaring Independence in Cyberspace, Internet Self-Governance and the End of US Control of ICANN. And Professor Mueller is a professor of public policy at the Georgia Institute of Technology, where he directs the Master of Science program in cybersecurity policy. And he is the author of 7 books and the co-founder of ICANN's non-commercial users constituency. So we're really pleased to have him share his expertise with us today and his insights. So just for people who are new to the seminar, because this is the first seminar of the academic year for 2025. So how it usually works is Professor Mueller will first present on his book, and then at the end we will have a Q&A. So please hold your questions to the end, and we will then move into Q&A after Professor Mueller's presentation. So without further ado, I will mute myself and please take it away, Professor Mueller.
All right. Thank you very much, Julia. It's great to be here. Of course, I would rather be in The Hague itself. It would be nice. I've been there many times and always enjoy the complex of international institutions and cybersecurity experts. And of course, I was a visiting professor at Delft for 3 years. 2008 to 2010, probably before Julia was born, but I uh, I really appreciate the intellectual climate in the Netherlands regarding cybersecurity and internet governance. There's a lot going on there. You have some very good scholars, and appreciate the opportunity to talk about the book. So this book came out in May, and it really represents, for me personally, a 20-year journey through the formation of a new institution, which of course was ICANN, but more fundamentally is about the unique identifiers that make the internet globally compatible. So as you might notice, from the title, what independence from what? What is going on here? What is the theme of this book? And at one level, of course, the most simple level, it was about the independence of ICANN from the United States government. But at a deeper level, it was about the degree to which cyberspace is independent, or at least the governance of cyberspace is independent of state sovereignty. And in that respect, the title is kind of echoing the famous manifesto of John Perry Barlow, which everybody loves to ridicule now, when he said, you have no sovereignty where we gather. And it was his declaration of the independence of cyberspace that was this famous manifesto. And again, since the sort of resurgence of state power in cyberspace, many people like to dismiss that. But when you come down to it, this story of ICANN is actually in some ways enacting the vision that Barlow had. So the book actually starts, its first chapter after the introduction is about what I call the showdown, about this independence. And it was about the attempt of conservative Republicans, or what would be more properly called the nationalist Republicans in the US government, to stop the independence of ICANN, to stop the transition uh, in 2016. And the arguments were, the internet is ours, we're giving away the internet, Russia and China will take over if the US leaves, or the ITU will take over. And also the claim which really wasn't very true, that US oversight protected free expression on the internet. So what was going on there? What first was the governance conflict about? And it wasn't really governance of everything that happens on the internet. It was fundamentally focused on what I call the internet registries. And one of the kind of happy things that happened during the writing of this book was for all the talk of internet governance, I noticed that people really never had a very clear idea about what was actually being governed. And in all of these debates about ICANN and IANA and the register, it's really about something very specific and something globally centralized, which is what I call the internet registries, which is really three different registries with different operational implications and different technologies. So there is the names registry, the domain name system, top level, root level of the domain name system. There are the numbers registries, that is to say, the registries of IP addresses and network numbers. And then there are other IETF protocols that have what we call protocol parameters, which again have to be coordinated. So it's all about having global coordination of unique identifiers. And I think that that's really very important to understand that that's actually what we're governing. So, for example, when we talk these days about governing AI, there there's no focal point for that governance. We don't really know what that means. But when we talk about the internet registries, we actually do know what that means. So there has been an ongoing debate, and probably you've heard this before, is that some people will say, you know, these registries and their governance, it's all very technical. It's just technical management, technical coordination. And other people will say, oh, it's very political. And in fact, they are both correct in the sense that governing the registry to provide unique identifiers obviously is embedded in a technical context. You know, if you're governing IP addresses, you're working from a standard that tells you how many numbers you have to allocate. But and if you're, you know, governing the root of the domain name system, you have a technical system which has specific characteristics that have to be coordinated. But in any registry, and this is recognized by the Internet Engineering Task Force and other technical bodies, there comes a point where you have to make decisions that are policy decisions. And this doesn't mean they're overwhelmingly political or that they determine the political structure of the entire surrounding society, but they are, in fact, policy decisions. And so, what triggered the eruption of internet governance conflict around 1995, 1996 was a very specific policy issues, and that was how many top-level domains should there be? Seems very kind of simple, but the problem was people were making money by selling registrations through top-level domain registries. So the question of who gets one, how many there are going to be, whether the registry would be a vertically integrated monopoly on that string, or whether it would be a shared registry that would allow competition at the registrar level. These were all policy decisions, not really technical decisions. And the biggest sort of policy or institutional question was who decides? Now, you see here a kind of a character of the famous John Postel, who was the computer scientist who was running some of these registries, or at least making the policy for them. And the question was one of, you know, why is a computer scientist at the University of Southern California making his decisions, you know, by himself, or why is the technical community making these decisions by themselves? Should there be a wider input? Should there be more of a institutionalized policy-making function? So that was what gave rise to ICANN. And in 1998, in 1997, uh, that was a very radical time in terms of our approach to governance of the internet. And you can see here what I call the 1998 consensus that emerged from this conflict over new top-level domains. It said there will be a completely new institution. We're not going to rely on existing governments. We're not going to rely on the ITU. There's going to be a new nonprofit private corporation that is going to basically be this governing institution. And by the way, this governing institution is going to be global. It's not going to be territorial. And it will have global representation. In the words of the white paper, it will reflect the functional and geographic diversity of the internet. And so the US government said, we're going to help you get this started, but we're going to get out by September 30th of 2000. And this policy approach of the US government was very consistent with a seminal policy document that had been issued by the US in 1997 called the Framework for Global Electronic Commerce. And if you read that framework, again, it was an extremely radical document. It said the internet is different from, traditional communications media. It says the private sector should lead, that governments should stand back, and that e-commerce should transcend territorial jurisdiction. So the framework for global electronic commerce was kind of a policy wonks version of John Perry Barlow's claim that governments have no sovereignty in cyberspace. And you see here Clinton and Ira Magaziner, who was the point person for the Clinton administration in the formation of this process. So, okay, we've set up this new institution. We have declared that the government's going to get out of the way. But yet the US government did not get out in September 30th, 2000. And the question is, why? Why not? Now, some people have said, they've really floated this out of the air that it was 9/11 that was the reason. It's something about, terrorism or something, but that had absolutely nothing to do with it. The US government stayed in control of ICANN because ICANN was a mess. It was an object lesson in how difficult it is to form a new governance institution by scratch. You had a group of people that set themselves up as the board that nobody trusted. You had John Postel died, and therefore their big claim to legitimacy was gone. You had warring interest groups. You had people like me who are interested in protecting freedom of speech and not giving trademark owners too much control over the domain name system. You had the trademark people wanting to have strong property rights over strings of characters in the domain name system. You had businesses. You had country code top-level domains. You had people who wanted to get into the business. All of them were thrown into this political context and told, well, go out and make DNS policy. And ICANN was set up in a way in which its processes and its governance was not very stable and not very accountable. And adding to that, ICANN was not really able to deal with this dominant registry that ran .com, a company known as Network Solutions, later as VeriSign. ICANN was essentially trying to get that company into its regime, and that company didn't want to be in its regime, and it didn't really have the regulatory power to force it, although the US government did. So that was one big reason why the US government stayed in control. And then there was another reason, and that was the clash with sovereignty. So just as ICANN was kind of raising itself up and entering into all of these conflicts, which the book describes in excruciating detail, The ITU starts the World Summit on the Information Society. And the World Summit on the Information Society essentially becomes all about internet governance. And the governments, this multilateral institution, are asking questions like, what's going on here? Why is a private California corporation making international public policy for the internet? In fact, what is the internet and why aren't we in control of it? And why does the US government have this special position over ICANN? Why is, this is not consistent with our notions of sovereign equality in the international system. So now you have two big problems with ICANN. One of them is what I call the internal problem, their internal governance structures and representational structures being unstable and frequently unfair and unaccountable. And you have the external problem of the inconsistency with this governance regime with traditional forms of state sovereignty. So you enter into a period which I call 10 years of limbo, in which the US government is kind of trying to nudge ICANN to be better and rewriting these memorandums of understandings and renewing the IANA contract. And we see the growing incursions of the Governmental Advisory Committee into what has supposed to be non-governmental policymaking. We see ongoing tensions with multilateral institutions, and we see growing concerns about ICANN's lack of accountability. And there's, a lot of descriptions and evidence about all of those things in the book. So what changed? What made this change? Well, here's what I call the triggers. Uh, the first one, everybody knows about Snowden and what an eruption that was, but fewer people are aware of the role of the WICET, or the World Conference on International Telecommunications, on this process. So the WICET was a redraft of the International Telecommunications Regulations of the ITU. And during this period, the sort of internet community became convinced that the ITU was trying to take over the internet. There's a lot of debate about that. I don't have time to go into the details of that debate, but fundamentally, those concerns were a little bit crazy. For reasons, again, that I can't explain. But fundamentally, the international telecommunications regulations had almost nothing to do with how the internet registries were governed. And yet, this threat that the ITU was out to take over the internet proliferated and sort of polarized the governments in the process. And so at the end of this process, we had a set of new ITRs, the first time they had been revised since 1988, by the way, so they really needed to be revised. And the sort of pro-Western, pro-multi-stakeholder governments all voted against revising the ITRs, and 89 nations, a pretty substantial majority, voted in favor of them. And this was interpreted as a sort of a referendum on multi-stakeholder governance. And Larry Strickling, who was the U.S. Commerce Department assistant director, who was kind of overseeing ICANN, he said this is what convinced him that they needed to do the transition, because he kept getting confronted, with, well, you say you don't want governments to be in charge and you want this private sector-led non-governmental governance structure, but here you are, a government, and you're in charge of ICANN. So he came out of this idea, he came out of this event with the idea that, we're getting hammered on this contradiction between our role in ICANN and our support for, this new institutional framework, which they came to call multi-stakeholder governance. And then, of course, there were the Snowden revelations, which again sort of put US activity, surveillance activity on the internet and US power over the internet really in the spotlight, and not in a good way. And so that led to this Montevideo statement in which all of these new internet institutions, the address registries, ICANN, the IETF, basically said, we need to do something about globalizing the IANA. And that led to this remarkable event. I don't know if any of you went to that, but it was in 2014. It was called the Net Mundial, and it was co-sponsored by Brazil's government, the Brazilian address registry, and ICANN. And it was like an international meeting, but it was not a multilateral institution. It was just this sort of temporary ad hoc coalition of the internet community and some of the global South states, including Brazil especially, to have a big discussion about internet governance. So in the book, I call that peak multi-stakeholderism. Well, the transition announcement came in March 2014, and here you see Larry Strickling. Um, and the US government said, we're going to facilitate this transition. We want ICANN to run it. We want it to be an open multi-stakeholder process. We're going to put a few criteria on there. You can't turn it over to governments, which nobody wanted to do anyway. You have to improve, you have to come up with some stable way of getting the US government out of its control of ICANN and ending the IANA contract. Now, during this process, which was very exciting, a very interesting time in ICANN's development, because it pulled that whole community, which was very fractious and contentious, it pulled us all together into, how do we make this work? How does this happen? And we made two key decisions. One of them was that we broke down the IANA transition process into three different operational communities, which corresponds to the three different registries I mentioned earlier. So we had the names community, the numbers community, and the protocol community. And that was very significant because instead of the IANA being one thing, it made it very clear that the IANA was actually three different registries responding to three different stakeholder groups, and each stakeholder group should have control over its part of the registry. That also made the politics a lot easier because the numbers community and the protocol community, the IETF, is very cohesive, whereas the names community is not. And so it detached those other registries from the politics of the names registry. And the other key decision, even more important, was, and it wasn't initially anticipated by the Strickling announcement of the transition, but the entire ICANN community came together and said, ICANN's accountability is a mess and needs to be reformed. And so the Commerce Department agreed that before any transition would happen, ICANN would have to really improve its corporate bylaws and become more accountable. Now, during this 2-year multi-stakeholder process, here's a list of the key battlegrounds that took place. One of them was the separability of IANA from ICANN. Those of us who you might call the radical accountability advocates, we wanted IANA to be something that contracted with ICANN, and if ICANN misbehaved, you could take it away from them. And we sort of won that battle. We ended up in kind of a muddled middle ground. You have to read the book to figure out exactly what I'm talking about there. The other was the question of membership. What powers, what rights does the community around ICANN have over the board and the corporation itself? And again, that was a very fraught and difficult battle, which again ended up with some middle ground in which, again, the community wanted stronger forms of control over ICANN, and ICANN's management wanted it to be more insulated from that control. And again, to find out how that was resolved, you'll just have to read the book. Although we can answer questions about that later. The other thing was we revised ICANN's mission statement. So we thought if ICANN is going to be independent, if it's not going to have the US government hanging over it, supervising it, we need to have a very clear sort of constitutional limitation on its powers. And among those limitations, many of us were very concerned that ICANN would not be able to use its power over domain names to regulate content on the internet. And we succeeded in getting a mission statement that included that limitation. And finally, we wanted an independent judiciary. We wanted an independent review process that would give people some kind of an appeal over bad decisions by ICANN and decisions that were perceived as conflicting with its fundamental bylaws. And again, that was fairly successful in creating a more independent judiciary. So you can see here, this is a constitutional moment, really. It's like a redrafting, a remaking of ICANN in 2015, 2016, creating these new bylaws. So the community came to consensus on these reforms, and we put them all before the Commerce Department. The Commerce Department blessed them, and we said, we're ready to go ahead with this. But again, there was this last-ditch effort by the nationalists in the US to stop the transition. And literally came down to the day before the transition was supposed to take place. There was a court in Texas, and they failed to stop it at the last moment. The court pretty much dismissed their case, and the transition went ahead. Now, the question is, what happened after the transition? And again, I'm presenting this as all about, the degree to which global governance of the internet can be escaping from state sovereignty. And so I consider 3 post-transition incidents to see how much they really did detach themselves from sovereignty. And so I look at the Ukraine request, which was a successful demonstration of how ICANN was positioned away from geopolitics. Ukraine said, we want you to withdraw Russian IP addresses and Russian domain names and basically cut Russia off from the internet. And ICANN and RIPE and other internet institutions all said, no, we're not going to do that. We are not a political institution. We are governing the internet for global interoperability. And we're all about connecting, not about disconnecting. And we're not going to be the tool of a particular political or geopolitical faction. So that was a success. The response to the GDPR was a much more mixed and interesting discussion. I was very involved in that, and you might say, okay, this is an assertion of sovereignty by Europe to impose its privacy regulations on the world. And in some sense, that is true. And ICANN was extremely resistant to bringing its WHOIS requirements and its contracts into line with GDPR. But by the same token, there had been privacy advocates within ICANN pushing for this same response since about 1999 or 2000. And so, in effect, the GDPR pushed or empowered those advocates within ICANN, and we did end up with some kind of a reform of ICANN's contracts that made that stopped, publishing PII, private information, in the WHOIS registrations. So that was, in some sense, successful. But and also we see in the GDPR response that ICANN's management was really, in some ways, very deferential. and wanted to say, well, this is a policy decision for states to make, not for us. And we're like, no, it's your contracts. Your contracts are global. They have to be uniform and they have to respect these privacy rights in order to preserve global compatibility of those contracts. And perhaps the worst performance in this regard was the org sale. So .org was proposed to be basically the Internet Society controls .org. The Internet Society said, we don't really want to be in a business and we don't want our mission to be tied to the registry industry. So we would like to sell this and get an endowment of about $1 billion that we can then use for our mission instead of funding ourselves through this alleged nonprofit called PIR, which runs .org. And the public interest groups, mostly in the US, made a big stink about this. Access Now, EFF, some others said, oh my God, you're selling org. It's going to become, the rates are going to go up. It's going to be, China is going to censor it. All kinds of scare tactics were used to make this a very scary thing. Uh, and ICANN's board was just, the issue here was not what side they took, you know. They did have control, the approval control, whether org could be sold. And the problem with ICANN's response was that they couldn't decide. They did not take initiative and say, here's our principles, here's what we think should be done. We are in fact in control of this issue. They just wavered until the California Attorney General basically threatened them and said, you know, I can go after you because you're a California corporation, so you will block this sale and or else I will come after you. And so the ICANN board essentially then made the decision not to allow the sale. And this was bad because the Brazilians and others involved in ICANN had said, you know, even though the US government is no longer strictly in control of ICANN through the IANA contract, it's still in US jurisdiction, and therefore it could be influenced by the politics of the US. And so this org sale demonstrated that very clearly that yes, uh, domestic US politics could in fact affect ICANN decisions by the board. So I also have a concluding chapter about how ICANN will evolve or could evolve. And again, I will leave you in suspense about that so that you will actually read the book. Well, in the final chapter, I make a contrast. To me, this is kind of a dear to my heart in the sense that I was there at the beginning of ICANN, and the contrast between internet governance in, you know, the late 90s, early 2000s, and AI governance now is something to behold. In those days, we had confidence. We were willing to innovate. We had a global perspective on governance. And with AI governance, we see overwhelming fear. You know, there's people who believe that AI, which is really nothing but distributed computing of the sort that the internet helped to create, AI is going to literally lead to human extinction, and we have to regulate the hell out of it to protect ourselves from being destroyed by an out of control machine. We see, you know, this absolute strong commitment to a globalized governance now being replaced with a geopolitical nationalism and competition among nation states, which, of course, based on national security and militaristic reasons. And again, we see this willingness to embrace governance innovation. As hard as it was, as difficult as it was, now we see, well, let's just go back to governance by states when we're talking about AI. So there's a big contrast there, and I'm basically saying, you know, the problems of internet governance and AI governance are not that different. And so we do have an example here with ICANN of a more optimistic self-governance option that, you know, with AI, there is nothing like the internet registries that would allow us to have some kind of centralized point of control. So that's a big difference. But in terms of the implications of governance and the mechanisms of governance, there are a lot of parallels between how we handle the internet and how we will handle AI. So I try to leave that thought in people's minds as we go forward.